Once we know our variable of interest, we've identified our population and a representative sample, we can then move on to arguably the most important part, which is collecting our data. So this page will be all discussing or around collecting data. So this all has to do with this third box. Because remember, we've been doing these last two all year. And we've talked quite a bit about the first two, just not directly like we did on the last page. So there's three methods for collecting data. There are three methods for collecting data. And I'm just going to go in the order that you see them in the table below. So from this little collecting data box, I'm just going to draw some arrows for myself. So the first one is an experiment. So from this little box, I'm just going to write one way to collect data, or one method, is to conduct an experiment. You could also do or run a simulation. So another way to collect data is to do a simulation. And we've actually done this in class together. It was one of the very first things we did in this class, a simulation. And then our third method is called sampling. And sampling is the focus of Unit 8. So sampling is the focus of this unit. I'm thinking about making experiments a separate, smaller unit. They go together in your book, but I think it's easier to understand them if you separate them. Okay, so these boxes below explain what each thing is. An experiment is when you impose a treatment on the individuals you are collecting data from. So this blank is the word imposes. An experiment imposes a treatment on the individuals in the study so that you can record the response. The treatment may be a medical treatment, or it can be any action that might affect a variable in the experiment. And then they give an example of such as adding methanol to gasoline and then measuring if it has an effect on fuel efficiency. So you would fill one tank of gas with methanol, and you would have one tank of gas that was not filled with methanol, and then you would compare the gas mileages. We looked at this with the caffeine withdrawal example. So we made the subjects take a caffeine pill for 2 days and then a placebo pill for 2 days. So the main idea behind an experiment is that I control what you do. So I'm going to write that at the bottom. An experiment, I control what you do. I have to be involved in some way. A simulation is, I think a simulation makes the most sense to be grouped with experiments. So a simulation is when you use a model to reproduce the conditions of a situation or a process so that the simulated outcomes closely match the real world outcomes. You do this for situations that are impractical to recreate or dangerous to create in real life. So the one that we did together, The one that is could be considered impractical for us to run an experiment on was the smelling Parkinson's disease. So we did a simulation instead where we simulated guessing whether or not we could smell Parkinson's on a t-shirt. So we simulated the process of Joy smelling the t-shirt and then deciding if she could smell Parkinson's. So that was one simulation that we did together. One that could be dangerous to create in real life are like crash test dummies. So I think most people have seen in their driver's ed class the videos of crash test dummies wearing their seatbelt and not wearing their seatbelt and comparing the effect that a collision would have if you're wearing one versus if you're not wearing one. So crash test dummies, we would never want to create that situation in real life. We would never put real people in a car and tell one of them to wear a seatbelt and the other one not to, and then ask them to smash themselves into a wall. That just doesn't even make sense. So a simulation is when it's not practical for us to do it in real life, or it's dangerous for us to do the actual experiment in real life. So experiment, you actually control what somebody does, but you got to be safe. And in the cases where you can't be safe, you have to do a simulation. The smelling Parkinson's is impractical because Joy is the first person really that's ever gained notoriety or ever been noticed to have had this ability. So it wouldn't make sense for us to gather a bunch of people and run an experiment on that in the first phases. We would first want to do a simulation. And if our simulation tells us that Joy might really be able to smell Parkinson's, we would move forward with something a little bit more powerful, like an experiment or an observational study. So first one is an experiment, second one, simulation. Then our last two are what this unit is on, and it's called sampling. So this, once again, is Unit 8. Unit 8 is sampling. So I'm just highlighting this box for myself. And reminding myself that this is what the focus is for this unit, this smaller unit that we're doing. Okay, there's two very common types of sampling. One is an observational study, and it is exactly how it sounds. An observational study is when you observe individuals and record or measure outcomes without controlling anything. So an observational study observes individuals and measures variables without controlling. One of the most important elements of an observational study is that it's only an observational study if you can do it without the people or the individuals knowing that you're doing it. They can know, there's no issue with them knowing, but essentially an observational study, you do not interact with your individuals or your subjects at all. So for instance, a good observational study would be something like observing how many people wash their hands after they go to the bathroom. So in our bathrooms, that would be weird because you would actually have to be in the bathroom to see. But in the newer schools, the bathrooms are different. So they're like ours over here. There's a boys' side and a girls' side, but the sinks are out in the middle. So in order to wash your hands, you have to come out of the bathroom. So you could just stand in the hallway and just watch people if they wash their hands, and they potentially wouldn't even know that you were there. Does that make sense? So observational study, it's only an observational study if it can be done without like meddling, without you getting involved with your subjects. And like I said, you can, there's not an issue with that, but sometimes they're gonna ask you, is this a sample survey, an observational study, or an experiment? And you may have to go back and think, well, would my subjects know that I was doing this? This one, so this experiment is I control what you do. Observational study is I watch what you do. So I watch and record. Observational study, I watch and record. Experiment, I get involved. And then the last one is the most common one, and I would imagine that most of you in this room have participated in this last one. This last one is a sample survey. So it just says survey, but I'm going to write above it the word sample, because really it's a sample survey. So a sample survey is an investigation of one or more characteristics in a population. In a survey, every member of the sample is asked one or more questions. So a sample survey is just when you are asked questions or you are asking questions. So right now, seniors are being asked to fill out a survey on Canvas for graduation preferences. That would be a sample survey. This one is I ask you questions. I ask questions. And then the simulation, hopefully you can see he's kind of his own little area of collecting data. The other three have easy phrases that you can use to remember. So an experiment, I control what you do. Observational study, I watch what you do. Sample survey, I ask questions. So we're collecting data. These are all methods of collecting data. Under sampling, I'm going to add in, I'm going to write underneath OS and SS, just for my own reference. So underneath sampling, right up here in my quick reference, sampling includes observational studies and sample surveys. So really, at this point, we have 4 ways to collect data: an experiment, a simulation, an observational study, a sample survey. So on the next page then, it gives you several scenarios and wants you to identify the method of collecting. So on this side, if you would prefer, you can just use E for experiment, S for simulation, OS for observational study, and SS for sample survey. So let's start with 2 minutes, and then we'll check in and see if we need more time. You're going to try all of these problems without me. Researcher, sorry, if you're at home, you might want to pause because we're going to go through the answers now. So a researcher records whether people at a gas station used hand sanitizer. That's definitely an observational study. A landscaper fertilizes 20 lawns with regular fertilizer and then a different 20 lawns with new organic fertilizer. Then he compares the 2 lawns after 10 weeks. This is an experiment. He controls the fertilizer. Members of student council at your school ask every 8th student who enters the cafeteria if they like the snacks. Sample survey. A park ranger measures and records the heights of trees in a park as they grow. Well, the trees don't talk, so this would have to be an observational study. A researcher uses a computer program to determine how fast the influenza virus might spread within a city. Simulation. That would not be safe for us to practice on real humans. A group of mice are put into a maze with multiple paths and options. Then they record the path and the time taken. That's an observational study. Even though they put the mouse in the maze, that's not an experiment. They didn't control anything that the mice did. They had to get in the maze some way. So technically it would be an observational study, even though you put the mice in the maze. A group of mice are given an injection. That's an experiment. The other thing that tells me that this is a observational study, because sometimes people really struggle with this one, we're not comparing anything. Like here, you compare the size of the tumor in this experiment. Here, you compare the lawns. But on this maze one, you're just recording the path and the time. You're not comparing anything. And then lastly, a group of students are randomly selected and asked. That would be sample survey. Which method of collection would you use to collect the data? The number of people that go into your local dentist surgery each hour. That could be observational. You could just watch and record. Number of books owned by people living on your street or village. Hopefully that's a sample survey. You're not just rolling up into people's houses counting their books. That'd be bad. And then this last one's interesting. How often a red card is drawn from a pack of playing cards in 50 draws? Now, I'm leaning toward observational study, but remember, when you do an observational study, technically you should be able to do it without getting involved at all. So this one is a simulation. The reason why is because you would not ever stumble upon somebody with a deck of cards that's just drawing out 50 in a row. You would have to ask somebody, hey, we need to draw a card from this 50 times and I need to record the number of reds. That would be a simulation. It seems like it's an observational study, but it's not. Are you guys okay with that one? And then last one, determine whether each data collection is an experiment or an observational study. A drug is given to a group of people and their reactions are observed. That's going to be an experiment because they gave the drug to people. The gender of children born in January is tallied. That's going to be an observational study. We feel okay about these ones? Yeah? Okay, so first page was box 1 and 2. We got to be really clear about population and sample. Second and third page, how do we collect data? The last page that we are going to do is moving now specifically to sampling. So where I say this unit is on sampling, this is now where we specifically start talking about methods of sampling. So we're going to page 804.